Kazi, Sedia, who's an associate professor of biology at Stockton. So I'm going to just briefly introduce the concept that we're going to be talking about and to kind of like just lay it out so that when we hear the speakers, we can be sort of familiar. So we're going to be discussing the term decarceration, which is a key term today in prison and police abolition movements, and as a way of trying to understand how the institutions of police, prison, and the criminal justice system contribute to the problem of mass incarceration in our country. An oft-cited statistic is that the US has 3% of the world's population, but over 25% of the world's prisoners, which is actually very similar to our COVID numbers, bizarrely. Similar to this is what has been termed the crimmigration system, with many of the similar private prison companies building carceral facilities for immigrants who are in prison in the Southwest. So initially, decarceration in the 1950s and 60s referred to the closing of mental health facilities such as asylums, but has now primarily taken on the meaning of closing prisons, but also more broadly to ending the ideological systems which created our current carceral system in the first place. Black feminist scholars such as Angela Davis, whose book, Are Prisons Obsolete? Ruth Wilson Gilmore in her Golden Gulag book, and Michelle Alexander in The New Jim Crow, and many others have worked tirelessly to draw attention to the mass incarceration systems around us and the ways that these systems are almost present throughout all of our other institutions, including universities. And so with that, I want to turn it over to our tech person first for a couple of Zoom 101 pieces of advice on how to view our next speakers. And that is Emery DeGiorgio, who is the Vice President of the Stockton Federation of Teachers and also a professor of writing at Stockton.
Thanks, Adam. Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'll be your Zoom IT person today. I want to start by reminding you that in the upper right-hand corner of the Zoom meeting, if you're using a PC, you can choose between speaker view and gallery view. So if you prefer to watch the speaker in their full glory, click on speaker view. If you prefer to look at the full panel of heads, you can go to gallery view. At the conclusion of the panelists' remarks, we're going to have a Q&A section. If you'd like to participate in this Q&A, you can click on the participants button, which is down at the bottom of your screen on a PC, and you'll be able to raise your hand, okay? And we'll call on you in order of when people raise their hands. If you have other technical questions, please feel free to use the chat feature and I'll respond to you. Thanks, Adam.
All right, thank you, Emery. And now for our first speaker, I want to turn it over to Kazi Sedia, who's going to be talking about the decarceration of the K-12 system.
Hi, everyone. So I am a biologist, but through my activist work, I have been working with a number of groups, and we have been looking at the effects police presence is having on schools in New Jersey. And we collected a bunch of data from New Jersey. For example, we looked at specific schools. In Upsticon, for example, the students of color represent under 16% of the student population, and yet they account for about 77% of out-of-school detention. In Ventnor, less than 5%, 22% detention. And basically in no town in South Jersey that we looked at were Black students experiencing any kind of disciplinary action at the rates that were proportionate or lower to their presence in the school system. It was always disproportionately larger. The lowest one, I think, was increase in 140%. That was like the lowest discrepancy that we found. And so, that is kind of obvious that the police presence usually results in disproportionate disciplinary action for the students of color, and especially Black students. At the same time, we recognize that, it's school to prison pipeline is obviously, a huge thing everybody is aware of, but the effects can be much more subtle than just that. In New York, for example, in the communities that have been heavily policed, and I'm talking about communities themselves, students experience higher rates of absence, especially Black students, and that was evident in students as young as 11 years old. So broken windows policies not only affect, where people live, but they also bleed into the systems of education. We also know from New York and Milwaukee that the very presence of police in schools results in higher rates of dropping out for students of color. And they don't even have to take any disciplinary action. Just seeing police around has a dispiriting and depressing effect on those students. So while university is obviously not a high school, it is, I think, naive to expect that those effects will disappear once students enter the university system. Also, if they have interacted with the police during the school experience, we can also expect that to color the interactions with the police on college campus. For example, and I have to acknowledge our colleague, Karen Wolf, who did quite a bit of work on that. Students in schools are oftentimes and again, due to a series of Supreme Court decisions, they stripped of their civil rights, such as, search, seizure of property, interrogation techniques, and whatnot. And especially students who have experienced disciplinary action, they have already been conditioned to kind of interact with this police in the sort of very much helpless way in which they really have no legal discourse to address any kind of violation of their civil liberties due to the fact that police have qualified immunity. So I do think that if we're going to talk about decarcerating campus, we have to talk about much more than just, oh, our police officers are very nice. I'm sure they are. I'm sure they are wonderful people, but at the same time, they represent the system that has been kind of abusive toward the students of color from very young age. And we need to think about how it affects them. And I'm going to turn this over to Saudia, who I'm sure will have valuable things to say from Philadelphia and Pennsylvania.
Cool. Hi, everyone, and thank you. Definitely excited to be here and to share space. And yeah, all the thoughts that were just expressed are very similar in terms of conditions in Philadelphia. So my name is Saudia, she, her pronouns. I'm an organizer with the Philadelphia Student Union and the current lead organizer on our Police Free Schools campaign. PSU, right, just in short, we work to develop high school students around social justice and particularly working on education justice campaigns. We exist to create space for students in high schools throughout Philly to meet one another, to talk about the conditions that they experience in schools, and then to have space with how to create projects that inform policies or implementation shifts. So what I can say that I've seen in this role and what's led us to this specific campaign, right, is that for a lot of students, especially students who depend on public education in Philadelphia, that a lot of the conditions that they deal with, right, often leave them, right, because our mission is like, we want to create high quality education spaces. A lot of students feel like they receive the exact opposite unless they are able to attend a private school or a charter school or even sometimes a special admissions school. That for most public high school students, they deal with a lot of conditions that tell them the opposite in terms of what you would want a young person to feel empowered to learn. They often attend schools where the ceilings or the building infrastructure isn't safe. Like there's been asbestos, right, which is a toxin that can cause cancer that's been discovered in a lot of high schools and have been there for a while, even elementary schools. They often see mice, see bugs. So there's like the physical, right, space that a lot of folks feel it's underfunded. And then there's also like the culture within schools that a lot of young people are affected by, where they may feel as though, you know, the culture within schools doesn't fully empower them because educators are under supported or have less resources to manage a classroom, or they don't get to see their counselor or their nurse enough because there's only one in a school that serves 500 plus kids. So those are a lot of the conditions, right, that's separate of the challenge of just trying to learn, right, in a big space, in a big environment. And those conditions, right, are what we identify as like the obstacles that prevent young people from feeling like they're empowered to learn or to be leaders. And what we see in the correlation, right, so right now we're in this global movement, this global moment where things are really shifting in terms of how folks recognize the larger conditions in the community. So for us, right, in seeing what happened to George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, and seeing seeing so many communities globally being ignited to do actions and to connect so many other issues to this larger problem of like, what does it look like when communities are invested in to thrive? What does it look like for communities and schools to have all the things that they need, and what happens if they don't? What we see is that there's a lack of safety and a lack of trust, both in schools and in communities, because there's a lack of resources. And those resources always go to policing, even when cities experience major budget deficits, right? So for us in Philly, we know that the Philly School District has been in this constant cycle of deficits and layoffs and just this never-ending cycle of feeling like there's always an area that's needed to be invested in but can't. But for some reason, policing or metal detectors or surveillance cameras, there's always enough money for that and not the other things like art programs or making sure educators have good salaries or making sure that the classroom has enough supplies or students can go on trips. So I guess just as I sort of shift in closing, right, what we see is that students either don't feel safe and or they don't feel like they're learning to the capacity that they could if their school and community was fully funded, right? Not just one special admission school, but like neighborhood high schools, right? Schools that are in the community that largely get underfunded. Those are the exact areas that have underfunding, but always have police presence that leave young folks feeling traumatized because officers either say things or do things that fall in line with how policing has been fundamentally, right, like targeted to harm Black and brown folks or marginalized folks. So for us right now in this moment, we're calling for police-free schools because we believe that once we have police-free schools and once we have a commitment from decision makers to spend its money on students, on programs, on staff, right? Once that focus happens, there won't be a need for policing because folks would have whatever needs that they have met and feel empowered to do the things that they're meant to do as young people. So yes, thank you.
Thank you, Sedia. Now we'll turn it over to Professor Kazi, who's a professor of anthropology at Stockton.
Hey, everybody, it's great to be here. I'm going to start with a little story. 2011, I was a grad student and I was an adjunct professor at the City University of New York, CUNY. And CUNY was founded to be a free public education for New York City residents. So in 2011, when the Board of Trustees, which had been taken over by a lot of people very cozy with Wall Street, et cetera, were trying to impose a 5-year tuition hike that really upset the students at CUNY, who remembered the original mission of the university. So students like me, adjuncts like me at the time, faculty and staff came together to basically plan to attend the Board of Trustees meeting where the vote would happen and in order to be able to speak out against the tuition hike at this meeting. So the day of the protest, we showed up and we were told that we would not be allowed to attend the meeting. We were greeted by armed guards and cops in riot gear for trying to attend a Board of Trustees meeting protesting a tuition hike. That night, a number of us got arrested. I got pinned up against a window by an officer's baton as he shouted expletives at me. So we see this like show of force and this magnitude of repression that you see, you would think we were trying to like overthrow the government, not protest a tuition hike, right? And so this raises some questions, like why would there be armed officers in riot gear at a university protest? Why did the university call on them instead of standing in support of their students? And how come there's like a ready fleet of armed officers for such mundane events? And yes, those are good questions, but actually I think that question sort of misses the point. I think the real question we should be asking is what happened at CUNY in 2011 an anomaly? Is it unusual? Is it out of the ordinary? Is it a disproportionate show of force? Or is it actually part of a long continuum of how policing works in the US and in campus settings specifically? I mean, that incident I just described, you can look it up and find it online. It was just days apart from the notorious pepper spray incident at UC Davis, when college students seated in the quad were pepper sprayed at close range for not breaking up their protest. And you can look up that incident too, even though UC Davis hired a PR firm to scrub images of it from the internet. But anyway, I think this question is actually at the core of what we do with policing in the US. Because if you think that, you know, what happened to Breonna Taylor and Tony McDade and George Floyd and Kenneth Chamberlain Sr. and Philando Castile, and well, I only have a few minutes, so I guess I should stop. But if you think what happened to them was because of like a few bad apples, or because people lacked appropriate training, or people lacked cultural competency, or suffered from my least favorite term, implicit bias, you know, if you think it was because there weren't enough body cams, then your solutions to the problems of hyper-policing are gonna look really different than if you think this sort of violence is actually foundational to the institution of policing itself. So when you take this foundational approach, it helps us contextualize what we saw here in West Philly just last month, where vast numbers of Black protesters were doused in tear gas and arrested en masse, which got way less press attention than the tear gassing that happened on 676. When you take that approach to understand what happened to the elderly man who was pushed down, knocked unconscious in upstate New York, then you can see that this isn't the product of some bad apples or poor training or a lack of oversight. And it's certainly not a problem of not having enough Black police commissioners or Black police officers. This foundational approach tells us that when the people who killed Breonna Taylor are not brought to justice, or when students at UC Davis are pepper sprayed for sitting in a quad at a school that they pay tuition to attend, or when universities spend close to $5 million on policing a campus during a budgetary crisis, that when each of these things happen, the system isn't broken. The system is working the way it was meant to work, okay? And so what I mean when I say that is I'm pointing to a history of where policing comes from in the US, you know, and I've been teaching students who have been studying, for instance, criminal justice for years who don't know how policing was invented in the US. So I'll just quickly give a quick overview of what that history is. Because in the northern cities, in the late 1800s, there was just vast labor unrest among immigrant workers, you know, Irish, Italian workers, and there were major strikes that took place, 1867, 1886. And in the aftermath of these huge uprisings, which really threatened the power structure, which really threatened the elite, the police, as Sam Mitrani writes, presented them as a thin blue line protecting bourgeois civilization from the disorder of the immigrant working class. But it had to yield some things to those immigrant workers that it sought to control. And so this is why cops in northern cities decided to stop policing Sunday drinking. And that's why they started hiring Irish police officers, okay? So in northern cities, police departments were literally invented for the purpose of suppressing workers. Workers asking for better pay, safer working conditions, shorter workdays, protection of their children. And so you can actually draw a straight line between that and then 2011, which I was just talking about, which was the year billionaire Mayor Michael Bloomberg said the NYPD was his own private army against protesters. And of course, in the southern states, we know this history, that police were created from among poor whites who quite often would find themselves in close alliance with enslaved Black people because they faced very similar kinds of exploitation and oppression. And the alliances that were formed between poor whites and enslaved Blacks were so powerful that the ruling elite had to get together and use these poor whites as patrols, right? They were turned into proto-policemen whose job was to catch enslaved people who ran away. I was recently listening to an interview with an author named Simon Balto, who's written a book called Occupied Territory, Policing Black Chicago, which is at the top of my reading list now. And he talks about the northern cities, right? And how the problem with German and Irish drinking and their labor organizing forced the city of Chicago to create the Chicago police force, to create literal red squads in the Chicago Police Department that would break apart leftist movements. And the media would help them, Chicago Tribune was in cahoots with this whole process and tried to give, the Chicago police a lot of positive press. And this was sort of the origin of policing in Chicago. But then the Great Migration happened. So like in the early 1900s, you had Black folks fleeing the racial terror of the southern states and going to Chicago and trying to settle in all parts of the city, but they faced what James Loewen calls sundown towns, which were parts of Chicago where they were literally chased out through violence, through ordinances, through all kinds of mechanisms. And so they went to the South Side and they built a vibrant community on the South Side of Chicago. So in the early 1900s, what the Chicago government decided to do was to urge police to kind of let the South Side go, like let lots of public drinking happen there, public sex work, all kinds of crime. They just turned a blind eye on the South Side of Chicago, right? And so Black folks who had built this beautiful, vibrant community on the South Side of Chicago saw it turn into this place where the mob, right? The notorious Chicago mobsters literally set up shop because cops were letting that happen. So this is the history of policing that escapes us very often, right? And this is why Miriam Kaba writes, "There is not a single era in the United States history in which the police were not a force of violence against Black people. Policing in the South emerged from slave patrols that caught and returned runaway slaves. And in the North, the first municipal police departments in the mid-1800s helped squash labor strikes and riots against the rich. Everywhere they have suppressed marginalized populations to protect the status quo. So when you see a police officer pressing his knee into a Black man's neck until he dies, that's the logical result of policing in America. He is doing his job." And that's in her really terrific New York Times op-ed, right? So what we actually need to do, well, what we don't need to do, and this is what Ruth Wilson Gilmore, Miriam Kaba, Robin D.G. Kelly, Angela Davis remind us, what we don't need to do is expand an already bloated criminal justice system with more money for implicit bias trainings, with more money for body cams, with more Black cops, Muslim cops, Mexican cops in the name of diversity, a term I hate to use. And we don't need to build stronger partnerships between cops and social workers. And we don't need to continue spending money we have on SWAT team vehicles for local law enforcement. And what we do need to do is decarcerate society, right? This is why the central demand of the movement for Black lives has been to defund the police. And this is why the central demand of the movement for Black lives to defund the police has been met by distractions. Mayors, governors, people in school districts have responded to the demand to defund the police by declaring new holidays, renaming streets, commissioning murals, because it's not in the interest of people in positions of power to defund the police, because as we see, policing is an arm of power itself, right? This is why Derek Bell, the famed Black scholar, warned us of what he called interest convergence, that when people in the top propose moves to improve the racial order, they're actually proposing things that leave the underlying systems intact. So I'll just close real quick by talking about the issue of campus policing, right? We know that there is a nationwide uprising right now for police-free campuses. And we know that armed campus police have grown exponentially, even though campuses remain largely safe. And that even their jurisdiction has expanded. So campus police often have an ability to arrest and patrol outside the campus jurisdiction, and that campus police face even less accountability than regular police forces do, okay? We know that the growth of campus law enforcement at universities often outpaces the growth in student enrollment. So the police departments are growing faster than the student body is. We know that several universities send their police officers to Israel to get trained by the Israeli military, even though what most campus cops are often doing is investigating the theft of a laptop or directing parking at a campus event or issuing underage drinking citations. They're going to get trained by the Israeli military to do that, right? The Department of Defense 1033 program has seen campus police, like the University of Maryland, get M16 semi-automatic rifles, armored trucks, camouflage Humvees, right, through this program. And there are hundreds of universities across the country that are part of this program. And so right here at Stockton, there's been a push to decarcerate our campus, to push to freeze the hiring of 2 new police officers, to end the presence on campus of cops. And especially in the midst of this COVID-19 budget crisis, it seems really confusing to a lot of us why we would be expanding a police force, right? And the good thing is, right? The good thing is this time around, I think we're actually not going to settle for the symbolic pageantry and the interest convergence. So we're not going to settle for things being cosmetically changed or tinkered with or renamed. We're not going to settle for task forces or sensitivity trainings or hiring more bilingual cops or putting them in less threatening uniforms. Like hundreds of college campuses across the country, we aren't going to settle for anything less than full decarceration. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Nazia, for those wonderful remarks. And we're going to turn to our final speaker before we get to a more open Q&A session, but I want to introduce Amelia Carter.
Well, we have
Wait, hold on, 2 more.
Oh, whoops, sorry.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. It's actually Christina Jackson.
Mhm.
Okay, so actually, yeah, we'll turn it over to Christina, who's a professor of sociology at Stockton. So sorry.
No, it's okay. Thank you, Adam. And welcome to this panel, everyone. I'm super excited to hear from everybody, and I'm super excited to see the ties between what we're saying together. One of you had mentioned, I think Nazia, you had mentioned about the incidents on 52nd Street, and I know that Amelia was deeply involved in that, and so I'm just super excited to see the threads. So anyway, like I said, welcome. I am for those who don't know me, I am a teacher, I'm a researcher on Black communities, I'm a mom of twins, and I'm also an organizer. I'm going to talk just for a few minutes about my thoughts around why decarceration is a necessary step to creating a just and safe campus. And I'll speak broadly about my research and my community engagement work. I speak on this from many positions, but today, mostly as an author and an activist who's been active at protests here in Philly. My first book, Embodied Difference, and second book, Black in America, The Paradox of the Color Line, both embody my research, which describe how race permeates the very foundation of American life through our institutions and the impact that it has primarily on Black bodies. I additionally do a lot of community work with Black communities and other communities of color. I was on the core team of, as you all may know, of Black Lives Matter Atlantic City for many years and still manage the Facebook page as a hub of information around racial inequality, access, resources, and organizing. I am also active in movements around gentrification, education, and environmental inequality in Philadelphia. In other words, I do too much. We must urgently separate the carceral state from educational spaces, including but not limited to higher education and K-12. I'm similarly working with other schools and folks like Saudia from the Philadelphia Student Union to do the same at my children's elementary school in Philadelphia. Why? Because institutions like the police department and others should be replaced with a system that at its core doesn't look at Black and brown people as inherently the problem. This has been the focus of my second book. How we understand crime from the perspective of sociology is cultural in the sense that it reflects the dominant ideas of our culture. So that has been crime-filled communities are synonymous with Black bodies, Black poor people. And even when Black folks are not in those spaces, they still face discriminatory policing that mostly all Black folks that I know have experienced with, including myself. In Brigantine, by the way, okay? Given that, we are at a critical time to reimagine what safety looks like in ways that are not anti-Black, in ways that Black people are seen, heard, and not invisible, and that they are properly valued for their contributions. As a sociologist, I'm most concerned with the relationship between institutions and people. As an urban sociologist, I analyze how urban spaces have been created off race, class, and power. Race and racism permeate the very foundation of our justice system. When asked simply why we are racist, Lawrence Bobo, Dean of Social Sciences at Harvard University, mentions history and a combination of things, but ends off saying something very sociological. Quote, "It is partly how we have organized relationships in particular, what kinds of forms of thoughts, action, and behavior that have become codified in law and routine practices," end quote. So in my view, our criminal justice system solidifies and perpetuates ideas of Blackness that result in being murdered for doing everyday things. In my book, I discuss Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, as someone mentioned earlier. And we say, quote, "Michelle Alexander argues that the contemporary carceral apparatus is not unlike an older system of social control, Jim Crow, that regulated the lives of Black people in the maintenance of a racialized hierarchy. Indeed, Alexander contends that the criminal justice system is less about preventing crime and more about structuring society," end quote. This to me is at the core of the carceral state. Racist ideas have led to how we code bad and deviant actions and behaviors in the minds of Americans, but it is also legitimized within a policing system upheld by laws that rarely indict the police officers for committing those crimes. For Black men that are in the system, that were in the system and are, quote, out, their lives are tainted as many are blocked from sustainable career ladder jobs. So they too are still stuck in this racialized hierarchy. I've worked with Black men in the Fillmore section of San Francisco in 2008 who have served their time, have re-entered the neighborhood, and attempt to, as they say, make good while desperately trying to avoid the gang injunction list as enforced by the police, and continuing urban renewal programs that make them feel like targets for removal by incarceration, eviction, or both. Their lives are forever changed and marked by the carceral state as they cannot find gainful employment and quality affordable housing. Lastly, I cannot understand why the carceral state should be extended to educational spaces just as a faculty member, but also as a mom, and particularly at Stockton, or even just arguing for more funding allotted for it. As Ruthie Wilson Gilmore, who was so luckily our past Paul Lyons Memorial Lecture speaker and professor of geography at CUNY, reminds us in her Intercepted interview, quote, "Many of our public agencies, education, healthcare, etc., have absorbed policing functions," end quote. So how does one reform our police system within institutions that were literally founded on keeping Black and poor people oppressed? How does one reform institutions in our neighborhood when our very city landscapes have been determined by race and class exclusion? Professor Gilmore in her interview provides an important abolitionist question for our campus, and hopefully we can take that up in the Q&A. What are the conditions under which it is more likely that people will resort to using violence and harm to solve problems? All right, and I know that's a very different way of thinking about crime. And then I'll add, how can we reimagine what safety looks like in ways that are not anti-Black? As others have mentioned, police reform bills and anti-bias training don't translate to a fairer system. As New York Times journalist Zach Cheney Rice notes, quote, "Armed officers have become the front line for dealing with homelessness, mental health crises, substance abuse problems, all issues that a social worker could do more effectively and less brutally," end quote. In closing, investing in other forms of public safety, social work, mental health, and equity initiatives promotes more safety and inclusion for Black people and other people of color. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. Now we'll turn to Amelia Carter for our final remarks today before we move on to the Q&A.
Hi, I will try to keep my remarks on the shorter side because I do think that having a discussion will be really wonderful, and I feel like everyone has shared such incredible information. So I think I'm going to start with something that might seem like it's off topic, but it actually relates a lot to campus policing, it turns out. On May 31st, I came to my house around 3:30 and found that we had been occupied by the Philadelphia police, who we thought was only the Philadelphia police. and was witness to several hours of an ongoing onslaught by the police on residents, my neighbors, of rubber bullets, blanketing the neighborhood in tear gas, point blank spraying people in the face with pepper spray. I witnessed elders being hit in the face with rubber bullets, and just hours and hours of this wave of violence by the police on residents. Long after, probably looting may have happened 20 minutes of the full several hours of this occupation. And it happened after the police had arrived, actually, and we are very much trying to investigate whether the police kind of incited the conditions for a riot to happen by arriving with riot gear and a SWAT team ready to pounce on a neighborhood. But after that experience, I woke up the next day and just was like very overwhelmed with what had happened. And then the next day witnessed what continued on as mass police brutality against protesters on 676. And felt like many people, like I have to do something. So that's when I got together with colleagues, alumni, and other people in the Penn community to try to organize around ways that we, as people who are working within this very affluent institution, how can we hold this institution whom we know doesn't pay property taxes, but has benefited from the gentrification of West Philadelphia, and has one of the largest private police forces in Pennsylvania and the nation. What can we do to hold this institution accountable? As we started organizing ourselves, we came to find out that Penn Police and Drexel Police were actually present that day on May 31st, and there are now videos and photographs emerging of Penn Police holding large pepper spray canisters and arresting people outside of their jurisdiction. As Nazia had mentioned, it turns out that campus police actually are full-on police departments who have the ability to police outside of their jurisdictions, even though their front-facing personalities and marketing is that they are there to serve the campus community. And as we know through things like Me Too and previous rounds of Black Lives Matter activism, often Black students and students who experience sexual violence on campus do not feel served by these institutions. So whether or not they are actually protecting students is a big question in of itself. So essentially, I started to work with the NAACP on their class action lawsuit against the Philadelphia Police Department, and I'm working with the lawyering clinic at Drexel University Law School on filing a complaint with the United Nations to get this act of police brutality formally recognized as a human rights violation. And the reason why it's necessary to do that, even though that kind of diverts from the conversation about campus policing, is that so far it's been more than a month since this has happened, and people are just now this week starting to care about this issue. It's kind of, it's an interesting reflection of the white supremacy that we're talking about, that the police brutality that happens in a residential neighborhood where literally people with babies and children had to flee their homes because their homes were filling up with tear gas. And then when they exited their homes, they're, greeted by rubber bullets. That is not seen as problematic, but 676, where it's a situation completely unjustified and unacceptable, but of majority white protesters who are being attacked, that actually gets the apology and the national attention. So by doing this work with the NAACP and the ACLU and Drexel lawyering clinic, we are hoping to create a circumstance where people start to care about 52nd Street and what happened there, and people start to understand this is a problem. the Penn police and Drexel police should not be policing Black communities outside of their jurisdiction. But it really speaks to what Christina was speaking to about how gentrification and campus policing are linked. And I think when you look at the history of how pentrification is an actual term, and that exists for a reason, because the expansion of University City, the creation of University City, only came from the destruction of a Black community called the Black Bottom, and the spread of Penn police through these Black neighborhoods in order to make them safe for white consumption. So all of these things are so intimately connected, and I'm so happy that everyone is coming together today to draw those parallels. So basically the work that Penn Community for Justice is doing, I'm also a part of Police Free Penn, and we're all working in tandem together to address this issue in as many ways as possible. It's very much like evolving every second of every day. But we started an email campaign where we are trying to get Maureen Rush, who actually she proudly takes responsibility for being the person who upgraded Penn Police's SWAT gear. She's also the president of the board of the Police Foundation. So we're trying to get Penn Police, and her specifically, to release a report on everything that Penn Police did that day. And also to explain why they were there. What was the circumstance that made them justify participating in a police crackdown in a Black neighborhood outside of their jurisdiction? And we also are organizing a virtual rally under the hashtag Police Free Campus, and we're hoping that this can be a part of the national movement where people can use that hashtag to explain their experiences with campus police, because people, I think, mostly think of campus policing as a benign, not so bad agency. And I think that we are trying to build some awareness around the fact that these are more than, a non-benign situation. So I don't want to run too much over time, and I want to leave time for questions, but I'm here to answer any questions that people have.
Thank you, Amelia. So I think we'll open it up to questions from the audience, and I want to remind everyone to use the raise hand feature because we have now 76 participants, and we won't be able to see you if you gesture on your camera. So to use the raise hand feature, you have to click on participants down in their bottom column, and then you'll see it on the right side of your screen. So I think Emery and I will be looking out for your raised hands. So we have one raised hand from an iPhone. I'm not sure who that is. So if you could unmute yourself so that you could ask your question.
All right, my question, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, my question is, well, I wanted to make a comment. You have to change the thought of police officers. And on college police officers, on the college campuses, a lot of police officers were formerly regular police who hired, like say Temple University. They will hire retired Philadelphia police officers. So that mentality of policing in the street carries over to the campus. You have to change their mentality. What is your suggestion or any of the panel's suggestion about how to change their mentality?
Thank you for your question.
Do any of our panelists want to respond?
Take a quick stab at it, and I'm sure others would have things to say as well, which is, I think, you know, one of the problems of the way we think about injustice, racism, inequality in America is that we think it exists in people's hearts and minds. And I think what that makes us do is it makes us regard injustice as a matter of individual attitudes. And, you know, time and again, like I've been teaching classes on race, racism, policing, war, etc. Time and again, you ask a student, an undergrad student, to define racism, and they'll define it as individual prejudice, like disliking people, being scared of people who are different from you. People will never say, you know, the likelihood that there's lead in your water, the likelihood that you're incarcerated for a low-level drug offense. Like, people don't think of racism in those ways. And so I think one of the things that might serve us really well is moving away from the attitudinal approach, or thinking that, you know, these issues of injustice reside in people's hearts and minds. Because where that leads us is, again, to cultural sensitivity trainings, right? It again leads us to cultural competence. It leads us to like, and what we actually want to do is think systemically. And that's what this moment, I mean, I think it's really beautiful that like systemic racism is trending as a hashtag right now. I mean, the conversation is about a system, right? Not about individual personalities, preferences. Let's say you were a cop working in a city that had a food sharing ordinance. So we know there are cities across the US that have criminalized sharing food in public, which is basically a code for feeding the homeless. So if you're a cop in that city and your job is to arrest or ticket someone who gave a homeless person a sandwich in a park, do you do your job? What if you were a cop in a city where sleeping under a bridge is an arrestable offense, right? I mean, why do we as a society arrest people for sleeping under bridges, but never arrest the gentrifiers, developers, and financial institutions who created the conditions that led people to sleep under bridges? So I think what we might do in this moment is realize this doesn't matter whether an individual cop has a great attitude, he's a lovely father, he's got a good sense of humor, or a lousy attitude, right? Actually, the problem is one of systems that are much larger than any individual. And I think the conversation on race in general will be improved vastly if we can stop thinking of racism as a matter of individual bigotry and instead of the systems that surround us.
If I can jump in as well. I do think that oftentimes, you know, like people, when we talk about systemic racism, what we mean really is you can have a system with like not a single prejudiced person in it, and the system will still be racist. And this is individual attitudes that are going to do very little to change it, as Nazia has said. And also the question is, I think, why the question that we're not asking is, why do we need police on campus? It is basically, you know, if like say I'm dragging a very heavy boulder chained to my ankle, people will say, well, have you tried carrying it this way or that way? Like, have you tried lubricating your chain? Like, you know, can you like maybe hoist it over your shoulder? But like, why am I dragging this thing in the first place? That's the question. Because campus police, I mean, they are a huge financial burden, emotional burden, and so forth. And the question should be like, why do we even have them? What is the benefit of having them?
And if I can also add on to what the other amazing panelists said, right? I think the question of like how to change the mentality of police officers also takes away from recognizing that what's happening is organized, right? The oppression and these interactions between law enforcement and young people or marginalized people, it's intentional and it's organized. And I love the way Ruth Wilson Gilmore talks about in this podcast about how it's organized abandonment, really, right? Like, police officers are being organized to abandon particular communities, but to show up for other ones, right? So I think it's also about shifting the narrative away from changing an individual person versus recognizing that police and police violence and terrorism, all of that is organized as a form of power against people who don't have power. And I think when we look at it that way versus, right, because when we're all born, of course, we don't naturally look or exist to harm other people or to commit violence against people. Those are all conditions that are socialized, right? And that's why we see these repetitive cycles, right, from 1967 You know, when students walked out and Frank Rizzo said, get their Black A's, right? And then beat students. And here we are in 2020 talking about the same thing. So I just wanted to add that it's really important to not put it necessarily on individual responsibility, but to really look at this as something that's largely orchestrated and organized.
And I just want to, I just want to second what everyone's saying. And I also want to say, to continue what Saudia was saying, that it's also economic, right? So in the case of gentrification, you know, for most of my research has to do with how the geography of capitalism works in urban cities and how our policies and our laws have dictated who lives where and why and when, right? Because that's shifting. And so, you know, and I wanted to second, I forgot who mentioned this in terms of the police as an arm of the elite, right, and the power. They are there to keep Black and poor people out of these neighborhoods because they think that they shouldn't be there, right? And to keep them in these small, tightly packed, congested neighborhoods that they should be in. This is not a new thing. This is very old. This is a process that is really to promote the economic interest of white folks, as well as Black upper class folks, because this is also a lot about class as well. And so I just kind of wanted to also bring that in as well, that this is, again, not something necessarily about hearts and minds. And, you know, that's how a system works. It's well-oiled and it works and it reproduces on its own, right? That's how it works and it keeps going. If you think of like this image of a factory and a machine, that's how I think about racism, as being systemic and being at the foundation of these systems. So I just wanted to add that 2 cents.
Yeah, they certainly don't prosecute wage theft.
No, and actually to add to what Saudia and Christina were saying, you know, when we were talking about abolish the police many years ago, we looked and we said, hey, look at the wealthy white suburbs. There's no police there. You know what I mean? You really have a hard time finding police in wealthy white suburbs where you find them all. Like I'm here in Southern California right now. In East Long Beach, they're driving around. But if you go down to places like in Lakewood, there are hardly any cops there. So, you know, policing is a class issue. It is racial, and you know, it's systemic. And you know, we always talk about down here in Long Beach. We always used to say, you know, always beware of the Black and Asian and Hispanic police officers, because they usually got something to prove to the white colleagues. They can be more brutal than the white police. You know, so I mean, this is something that we always kind of already grew up knowing. So I want to go to our next hand is Robin Hernandez Mekonnen, who is a professor here in social work, I believe. So Robin, go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, I'm driving, so I hope you can hear me okay. That's why I'm not on video. So my question, and I know this seems like a strange question, and it kind of gets on the back of a question that was kind of just answered. And why does Stockton, I mean, maybe there's some kind of old heads on the call that could, you know, speak to this. So why does Stockton have a police force? There are many campuses that don't. I'm just wondering what the impetus for that was, and could we? I mean, I looked at the report that Heather sent that detailed essentially all of the police actions over the past 2 years, and it seems that our police force is serving as a supervisory agent and an Uber service, and I'm wondering if we couldn't just do away with the police and find some substitute for those two main services.
Thank you for your question, Robin. Any of the panelists want to respond to this one?
That's the question of the hour. That's all I have to say.
I believe the genesis, as discussed elsewhere, was that people felt that like the Galloway police somehow is not able to respond in a timely manner. That was the rationale that was given, I believe. But yeah, I mean, it's literally, they can be replaced, by a couple of traffic cones and, an app. Because most of what they seem to do, like the escort service and presence on at events, and definitely this heavy police presence at board of trustees meetings have been disconcerting.
Yeah, and I'll also add another piece of this. I feel like in my research, I always thought that I don't directly do stuff on the police and criminal justice system, but now when I'm thinking back, like it very much is intimately tied with that. So my older work on San Francisco was really looking at meetings around gentrification or the renewal of neighborhoods or environmental cleanup between the Navy or the redevelopment agency and the community. And I wrote a chapter in Embodied Difference, which I co-edited, about policing the Black and brown body in these particular meetings. And so I think that that's a really important way, and what I talk about in the chapter, and I'm happy to share it with anyone, that it's really part of the way of suppressing these voices. And so I wrote rich ethnographic detail about how these like armed police officers would be at these community meetings, intimidating people, especially if they have records, to come to these meetings. And residents actually stood up in San Francisco and voiced that like, why are these armed officers at these community meetings? And they look at it as a way to kind of suppress the dissent that they have for the process of cleaning up or who's moving in a neighborhood, things of that nature.
And I just want to add that oftentimes the suggestion to upgrade campus security into police forces comes from preying on the fear that people have. So fear of mass shootings. And in the case of Penn, a lot of times, fear of the outside community. So that initially was stoked, especially in the 90s, there were a couple of big cases of faculty, like one faculty person, maybe one student over like a 10-year period experiencing physical violence. And that was a part of how Maureen Rush and other leaders in Penn Police were able to expand their reach, expand the amount of officers being hired, expand the amount of funding that they were able to get, and so on. So that aspect of building off of people's fear is a big component. And I don't know if Stockton has this, but we actually have an alert system where anytime anything happens to a Penn person by an outside person, even if it's just like suspected, we will get an alert, a text message and an email that says, attention, Penn Police at the site. We are here to investigate this situation. And then usually within 45 minutes, and it also warns people, don't avoid this area. Within 45 minutes, we get a follow-up text. Penn Police has resolved this issue. It is now safe to continue life as normal. And it really creates this anxiety of like, oh my gosh, like what happened? And if the issue can actually be resolved in 45 minutes, chances are not that much happened. Chances are people were probably continuing to walk past that corner where whatever went down, and were completely unaffected. But the point of it is to continue to stoke that fear and continue to make people believe that you need us. That's why we're here, is because without us, this could be you. And thank God we were here to come and rescue you. So just another thing to consider about whether it's Stockton or Penn, how did they get here? Fear.
Thank you all for your wonderful replies and answers. Our next question comes from Susan, who has her hand up. So I'll turn it over to you, Susan.
Thank you. I guess as a follow-on, how do you respond to that fear? Because that is the biggest argument I get when I try to bring up when I try to bring up decarceration or defunding police. They will always send people always send me articles of how Chicago is begging for their police force back, and so I feel like it's probably just one of those things that's going to be a constant battle and a constant, suppression of the fear. But, as I have to, and I totally support this cause, but I feel kind of foolish because, my daughter's going into college this year, and I had, the same fears of, what kind of protection does she have for, sexual assault when she's walking alone, and, yada, yada, yada. So how do you deal with that fear? How do you suppress it? Or do you realize that you just can't suppress it? It's always going to be there and you have to keep marching. And so my second question would be, what stepwise actions can I take, or are you all taking, besides like complaints or investigations, to kind of move forward?
Thank you, Susan. Anyone want to take this up? Because this is actually a very good question that
I actually did some research on K-12 thing, which can be actually very relevant. And part of it, there is a lot of parental concerns that, police, of course, gives white students the sense of safety, not Black or Hispanic students, but white students the sense of safety. It is, however, not accurate, because there is research that shows that presence of armed officers does not deter school shootings. They occur at equal rates, whether there is police presence or not. There are studies there, and that basically kind of pretty much demonstrate that it's not a deterrent. And the second part of it is Supreme Court ruled time and time again that no any given police officer is under any obligation to protect this person at this point in time. And this is basically what happened when I believe one of those resource officers ended up hiding in the closet during school shooting. It was ruled that he was well within his rights not to actually react to the attack. So presence of the police is neither a deterrent nor a guarantee that they will do anything. So that is kind of the most, I guess, surface level argument about safety issue that basically comes up. Also, they talk about Chicago wanting the police back. Well, in New York, several years back, I believe police, they sort of decided that they're not going to respond to calls, because I think it was like a union action when they basically decided that like you'll miss us when we're gone. And crimes actually went down because a lot of crime was basically the result of overzealous policing. Far as sexual assault is concerned, I think we know fairly well that police does very little to prevent sexual assault from happening, and community accountability seems to be a much better way of doing it. Like literally students escorting each other, when it might not be safe, or like traveling in groups, is generally a better approach than calling the police under those circumstances. And of course, they're notoriously bad at prosecuting sexual assault after it has occurred. Also, anecdotal, I admit that it's fully anecdotal, but every woman I ever talked about being stalked or escaping domestic violence situation, every time there was escalation, or say, the husband whom they escaped found them, was because they had a body on the force. So I think there is plenty of anecdotal evidence that police oftentimes tend to protect not the victim under those circumstances.
Saudia, you had some comments?
Yeah, definitely have overlapping thoughts with what was just shared, and really appreciate this question, right? Because it's probably one of the most important questions, which is essentially like, what do we have in place of policing for accountability? And my first sort of thought is something that I'll again share from a podcast that I listened to with RWG, where she framed that it's important for us as we transition to imagining this world post-pandemic, hopefully, that we also think about what kind of world do we want to return back to. And if we're understanding that we want to go back to a world that doesn't have police, and that we're identifying that we can't end police or state-sponsored violence on folks unless we abolish police. That we also have to shift away from looking at crimes as crimes and really start to look at crimes as harm, right? Because when you look at crimes as harm, that's when you're able to, one, not try to stigmatize folks who are like the bad folks who will never change versus the good folks. I think it's really important, right? Especially when we're talking about things that are very sensitive and have deep, deep impacts on people's lives, like sexual or domestic violence, that it's important to shift to thinking of it as harm and an opportunity really for someone who has experienced harm to get what they need for that harm to be restored or remedied in whatever way still allows for folks to be humanized. I think it's really critical for us to start thinking about how do we pull together resources to either create or to support organizations that can do that work. We know that it's there now, right? There are a lot of folks, and specifically thinking about like schools, right? So for us, when we say police-free schools, we're saying we want to see restorative justice practitioners and resources, which is what educators right now aren't getting enough support of in Philly. They're being trained on like how to call 911 or how to restrain a student in a certain like hold, but they're not getting the resources to facilitate a conversation where harm is happening. So I really think it's important for us to, as these conversations move, right, for us to think about not only shifting how we look at crimes to them being harm, but really seeing this as an opportunity, as it was said, right, for this to be a moment for community control and community stake into stepping in on accountability. Like right now, we shouldn't rely on police, like that's the point of abolition, but we over rely on police as well. Like folks call the police when they're just being inconvenienced by loud music. George Floyd was murdered because a convenience store owner called the police because he thought he had a bad check. That is not something that call should have never been warranted if we're aware of the ramifications for what happens when police show up. And if we know that that's fundamentally the role and what's protected is state-sponsored or organized violence, then we really have to take accountability as a community to step in ourselves when there is violence, for men to step up and challenge patriarchy and misogyny that allows for sexual violence, because that's the work that's needed to really prevent it, right? And not just react or respond to it. And the same for schools, right? If there's a fight that happens, we're asking for educators, right, or administrators to take on the responsibility and the challenge to support the good and the bad moments that you go through. Like, we understand that it's obviously challenging to deal with a fight or a moment of violence or to be concerned about like your safety or well-being. But we really want to tap in that developing young people in schools should also look like showing them how to handle conflicts or moments of violence, because that's an opportunity to transform culture rather than just shifting it to a prison.
And Saudia, I also just want to also add to what you were saying. If we all remember years back, and thank you, Carol, for the book that you put up, the case of the girl that gained national attention, I'm sure it happens more often, over a cell phone, and she was body slammed by a police officer in the classroom. And so I'm thinking about how that's affecting her, obviously, what she's learning, but I'm also thinking about what everyone else is learning, right, in that classroom, right? So it's like, I think that it's really important to think about how that type of violence becomes normal and part of the classroom process, and how that trauma kind of stays with these students and teaches the other students that, like, you know, you need to stay in line or else this type of thing will happen to you too.
All right, thank you for that question, Susan. And to move on to our next question comes from my literature program colleague, Emily August, who has her hand raised. So Emily, go ahead and ask your question or make your comments.
Thank you, and thanks everyone for just such a rich and illuminating discussion. This is just an incredible resource, and I'm glad to see us all being brought together for this purpose. My question was actually really similar to Susan's, which is, if we are, if the panelists have ideas at this point, what are some specific, concrete next steps that we can start taking to manifest what we want to see, which is this decarceration? And what are some barriers that you think we might run into, some specific literal barriers, and from what directions? And so that we can start to anticipate that and start to, you know, come prepared for resistance to manifesting decarceration.
Thank you, Emily.
I think in terms of the barriers, Emily, I think one of the ones I get most frustrated with is the co-optation of movements. And I think this is something that, like, people in positions of power have really crafted the art of co-opting the demands that are made by people on the ground, grassroots movements. So that's why I in my comments earlier, I really was very deliberate about the ways in which that is done. You know, I mean, that term that was just used, I think Kathy mentioned it, school resource officers, it's just another word for cops, you know? And I think we have to be 2 steps ahead of the co-optation game, because they are very quick to, people who are, you know, who benefit from the violence of policing have really honed their skills in terms of co-opting the demands that anti-carceral folks are making. And so we need to be crystal clear about what our goals are. And I think what's really profound about this moment is people who are for the defunding of police and people from the abolitionist movement have been very, like, have just kept like a laser focus on their demands. And that's absolutely what we need to do. And I think, you know, I mean, if you are lucky enough to get to teach about these matters or engage with folks who are beginning to think about these matters, it's actually very important to teach about the ways in which political pageantry kind of comes in and steals these movements and turns them into something else, and turns them into, you know, corporate initiatives or diversity initiatives, and end up being total diversions from the issue at hand. So I think that for me is one of the big barriers, but I'm also the most hopeful that we have evolved a lot in our ability to recognize this threat at this point.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. And I would add committees. That's what Penn loves to do, is make another committee, which committees is just a place where activism goes to die. So we don't want another committee about any subject. We want to see a real act, a real action, defunding by millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars, and then eventually working to the disbanding of campus policing systems is what we want to see. And by breaking these systems down, we will be forced to have to come up with an alternative model. And that model should be led by the people. It should not be led by a committee which has on it people who are, you know, in bed with the trustees, who are in bed with the, you know, policing apparatus that they benefit from directly, and so on. So it has to be people generated. And I think that some people already know some methods, but I think a lot of us are still discovering methods. A lot of us are still learning about these things, some of us for the first time. And so I think that it's okay to not know. At least we know what we don't want to see anymore and what we need to shut down immediately, because these mechanisms are causing active violence and active harm. So at least we can stop that harm and then work towards finding a solution that works for us in our unique circumstances. What works for Penn won't work for Stockton, and that's okay. We don't need to have a one-size-fits-all, which is what the campus policing system kind of created. It was that one-size-fits-all, so let's just all turn every campus security into campus policing. And so challenging that, I think, will be key. Letting it be a little bit messy in order for us to find the right answers.
And I do think that in terms of specific steps, what we had was basically asking for a freeze on hiring of the police officers, and basically we can keep asking. We can ask for determination of police presence on, you know, events like what do we have? Coffee with hops, pizza with hops, like brioche with hops. Like I don't know what we have. I think also we talked about bring your child to school days where there's very heavy police presence, and those are things that we can ask for immediately, and only kind of as sort of stepping stones on the way, toward full decarceration. We can ask for stopping, police presence at the Board of Trustees meetings. And we can basically also simultaneously talk about alternatives. For example, police does a lot of escorting for people who miss the, last shuttle, which is a problem. So what can we offer instead? So instead of calling the police, who else can people call? And this is, perhaps something for us to work on the community level. And yeah, of course, sort of refuse the co-optation. I wish I remembered who made this joke about naming Pentagon into Maya Angelou War Center. But that seems to be, sort of very much the direction things tend to go in.
I'll also share, some next steps for us, right? I agree with everything that was mentioned, right, around co-optation. I think it's also about some next steps that feel good are, one, being in solidarity with like other cities and being in collaboration, because a lot of how we showed up in this work came from being able to have partnerships with organizations who had already been doing the work on the ground. So like, a helpful partner for us is like the Black Organizing Project. Before we got to a point of abolition, we had done campaigns on like, how do we create a complaint system? And we learned that from our partner in Oakland. And it's similar now to this Police Free Schools campaign, right? Where we launched after what we saw happening and in the moment. And we did that also leaning on Black Organizing Project, who won that campaign. So I would say definitely being plugged to other folks to identify the trends. I think another important step is for folks to be engaged in directly having conversations with decision makers and being aware of who are the decision makers who can give the organizations what they want. So for us, we've been directing folks to email Superintendent Height in Philadelphia and the School Board of Education and asking that they introduce a resolution on police-free schools and voting yes to it. And if they can't, we want to understand and have transparency on why or what are the arguments that are being made. And another thing that I also want to add that also came up in my mind is like, just being aware of like how often decision makers will say things in good faith. And sometimes that will feel like there is support. But often a lot of times, like those are things that are symbolic, but don't necessarily translate to an actual policy or institutional change. So just really calling on decision makers to be engaged by like emailing them or tweeting them around where they stand on these issues.
I want to, there's another hand up, but I want to just encourage the viewers who are in South Jersey and part of the Stockton community that when we talk about steps in terms of a hiring freeze, you can take immediate action on your own, and some of us have. You can email the president and the members of the Board of Trustees. All of their, you can look up the board members and all of them have stockton.edu email addresses. So if you just put their name in the Stockton email system, their email address will self-populate. So you can send emails to the board and to the president who are ultimately making the decision about these hires. And despite the resolution that the board passed in support of the Black Lives Matter movement and working towards some form of equity on our campus, there was no mention of the hiring freeze, and many people emailed the board and the president in advance of that meeting. So you actually can email those members, and you can also have these conversations with your peers who are still wondering what it means to defund the police. Okay, so I think one of the hopes of this conversation tonight was about sharing education with each other. And I think that we can make some real action by engaging in these conversations with each other, off of, sometimes we have those explosive Stockton emails and we're not always communicating well with each other, but this is a real opportunity for you to have conversations with people about this. So I just wanted to add that in terms of like local actions that you can be doing, you can start with those. So I don't know if panelists have other comments before I open it up to more questions. Do the panelists want to add any more? Okay. So we have someone who's listed as K-Sen. K-Sen, I'm going to invite you to speak.
Hi, I'm just wondering, in this moment where, we're reading about campus abolitionist groups across the nation, in what ways are any of you collaborating with campus abolition groups all across? And do you see growth in that direction in the future? And, whether you see that as like an important sort of counterpoint to the proliferation and growth of campus police everywhere, just some kind of like national movement, like a national organization that could speak out on these things as a unified front for faculty, for students on campuses everywhere.
I'll just say that is what Penn Community for Justice is trying to do with the virtual rally that we're organizing around the hashtag Police Free Campus, is to recognize that this is a part of a national movement. That hashtag was actually, we didn't realize it at the time. We thought we came up with it and we're really clever. And then we realized that Scholars for Black Lives actually already grabbed that and have a website set up and have graphics that you can use. And language you can take from. So this is definitely, there is a national movement going on. And I think that we are trying to join hands with Drexel Community for Justice and defund Temple Police and some other local folks who are organizing around this issue. To at least make it a citywide campaign, if not a national campaign. We're definitely going to try to find speakers from other universities that are organizing, and if possible, make international connections, because especially like in places like Delhi in India, for instance, it comes to mind, the policing situation there has been incredibly bad at JNU. There was a huge case where the police were colluding basically with extremists, not unsimilar like the extremists that we have here, political and religious extremists, who were attacking students, and they were colluding with the security force there that are armed police. So, finding that this is a global issue and making those connections and using, COVID has put us all online. So using that to our advantage for once and building those coalitions for more direct in-person actions on campus, I think will be a really key aspect to moving our movements forward.
Yeah, I also just wanted to add, Kasturi, that even though it's a little bit different, I just want to add on the importance of also connecting with our K-12 schools. And so that's what I've been doing in Philadelphia. That's how I originally met Saudia, because a couple of, I guess it's location too. So I live in West Philadelphia, and I'm right outside of Penn. I can't live right around Penn because I can't afford it because of gentrification. So I live, further blocks out, but my kids go to Lee, which is a school called Lee, which is funded a lot by University of Pennsylvania. So what some parents and I know other parents on this call are doing too, is we created especially faculty that are parents that have our schools in the school district, we created a letter and a petition to pass around to try to build that coalition between police-free schools and campuses as well. So I think it's also important to have more, just in terms of organizing, have more of a broader view that this is really not just about Stockton. And, you know, I don't know if a question is coming up about, well, at Stockton, we haven't had these bad incidences, but in other places, those other ones, they really need to do that. Like, it's really not about that. It's about a larger, broader movement and connecting how this works in higher ed, as well as, especially for parents, as well as how this is affecting our kids in their schools. So I'm pro building coalitions with like other national campus organizations, as well as K-12 schools too.
Thank you for that question. Next up with our hand raised is Mac Avery. He's a professor of political science at Stockton. So I invite you to ask your question, Mac.
Thank you. I feel like this is something I should know, but I don't. So I think this has come up at previous meetings for those of us at Stockton. But so do we have information on like exactly what are the number of police? What is the police to student ratio? How much do we spend? For what reasons are they called? How frequently are they called? It seems like this information and making it public so that everyone can see it. I think I remember people saying that they've gone to the police and asked them for information and they've been reluctant or, you know, to provide it. But this seems like something that we could do, that we should be demanding of the administration. We want information about what our police are doing and how the money is being spent. Does anyone know about this? Thank you.
Actually, Heather McGovern, are you in the audience? Would you like to, I know that you shared the Oprah response via Stockton email. Would you like to speak? Heather?
I can. Oh, okay. I just am trying to share, but have failed, but I'll try again when I'm not speaking. I put in an Oprah request because I asked nicely and I was nicely informed that that's what I could do. And I got that data on Friday and I've put it's a like 200 some page PDF. So I've had to put it in a Google Drive to share it. But it's open to anyone, and I'll try to put the link in the chat so that people can look at it. It does include the overall budget. I asked for a detailed line item budget. It does not include that, but I am now supposed to meet with Jennifer Potter and Donnie and Michelle in a couple of weeks to discuss the request for a more detailed budget, and also the concerns of administrators that the budget information that I shared needed more context, whatever that means. So, but that document also includes a lot of information about what the police have actually been doing that have come. So other speakers today talked about that apparently the police do a lot of attending events and escorting people and giving rides, that kind of thing. So I'll provide that, what the information we do have. We need more information than we have, but I'll provide what we do have.
Thank you, Heather. Thanks, Mac, for your question too, because I'm sure others were curious about that.
If it's helpful, I can also share some stats of what we know about how policing exists in Philly too. So what we know from our budget is that there is $3 billion total for the school district budget. That right now, 30 million out of that total budget goes towards employing school police officers and employing whatever sort of surveillance equipment, right? So or 31 million, right? So it's been a $1 million increase in the last year and a little over close to 2 million increase in the last 2 years. We know that the school district got and approved a grant for about $150,000 for new school police uniforms, and that was in January of this year, and that was when also students were talking about going days without having soap dispensers refilled in the bathrooms or having toilet paper restocked in the bathrooms. But that 30 million is also interesting compared to the other roles. So right now, only 18 million is spent on school psychologists in Philadelphia. There's only 21 million that is spent on counselors total in Philly. And then about 34 million is spent to cover nurses. So for us, those budget pieces are definitely scary, especially knowing we're in a pandemic and the school district is preparing to potentially reopen in September and have made no commitments to at least reinvesting in having more nurses added, knowing that there's going to be a need for more safety protocol. So that's sort of just like some of the budget pieces that we know around Philly. Oh, and that employs there's about 358 school police officers under that amount and about 38 security guards.
Thank you all. I see no other hands up, but can I ask a question? Do you think we have time? All right, so seeing what just happened in Portland and what's being threatened in other cities around the country, and I have a personal interest in the connection here, and Nazia kind of brought it up in her opening remarks. But what is the relationship to you between the police and the military? And I kind of want to preface this by saying, like, you know, it was Obama who actually like signed laws that enabled police departments to buy military grade equipment from military contracting companies, especially armored personnel carriers, what were they called? LRAD, long range acoustic devices, machine guns, including our own director of public safety, whose previous job, he actually bought military grade weaponry for his own university police department. So I wanted to ask like what your thoughts are on connecting the police to the military, because on other universities, not at Stockton, but there are other universities which military recruiters are there. High schools are, especially high schools in low income neighborhoods, are prime for military recruitment. There's a very close relationship between veterans and the police forces that we do see, these militarized SWAT police. Many of them have military backgrounds or veterans. And so to me, it poses a kind of a question that when we talk about veterans and military and the police, that a lot of times we leave out the piece that actually helps us to think about the connection between the two, which is these budgets that help fund, you know, like, I mean, I always hear it from other police chiefs when they say, why did you buy all of those weapons and whatever? Well, we got a grant to do that, you know, so we had to use it or we lose it. And so there's this kind of economic, you know, incentive for police departments to militarize. And sometimes we tend to not think about the connection there. So any thoughts or ideas that you have on how we can actually create a stronger link there in terms of anti-police and anti-military activism?
Yeah, this is one of my favorite things to talk about, so I won't get too carried away, but you know, it really struck me when I was hearing about what's happening in Portland as we speak, right? Protesters being whisked away in rental cars to unmarked locations by federal agents. I was like, oh, this is weird. Oh wait, it's not weird, because Homan Square happened in Chicago. I believe that was under the Obama administration. Homan Square was basically a black site where people who were protesting, I believe it was like that NATO event that happened, and folks who were protesting against the Iraq War were whisked away to this black site where, you know, ordinary people being arrested in Chicago had been whisked away to. And when I say black site, I mean it's like an off the grid location where all kinds of procedural practices that are typically followed around arrests and things like that are totally off the record, right? And so what is happening today in Portland looks like what happened at Home and Square a while ago, but also looks like the, polka dotted Black sites that the CIA and US military have set up around the world. And so I think, for me, like, I'm pretty left of liberal. And so I think for me, when I look at the liberal reaction to outrage at what's happening in Portland right now, is I'm like, maybe people just don't like what's happening in the US because that's what we're supposed to be doing to other Black and brown people around the world, like not our own in this country. Because I think that's what you're pointing to, Adam, in your question is something we call like carceral imperialism, like the technologies of policing and surveillance in the US and the technologies of policing and militarism abroad are part of the same process. They feed off of each other. In the case of the military providing weaponry to local police departments, or the Israeli military providing training to local police departments, it's like the literalization of that, but there are very symbiotic processes there. I mean, you have heavy police presence at university board of trustees meetings for whatever reason, but you have heavy military presence at like football games. And so it's just part of like a deep systemic violence that is part of American life. And so I think, when we're talking about what Saudia was talking about earlier, the eagerness with which there is funding for police presence at schools that don't have hand soap, for students. There's also, an eagerness to always increase the US's military budget. I mean, when Trump proposes a military budget to the Senate, Democrats and Republicans alike will respond and say, no, that was too low. We want to give you more. So the same people who will brand themselves as like the hashtag resistance, they can't stand Trump, they think he's a fascist, but then they want to give him a bigger military budget than he even asked for. So it kind of reveals, and I think what both policing and American militarism reveal is the coziness of our two political parties as well. And I think there's really great room there to start that conversation, because the more you look at them, the more the parallels just become so obvious.
So is there a school to prison pipeline? And then there's like there's a cop to soldier pipeline, or maybe a soldier to cop pipeline, right? Like, so we're going to look at.
There's also school to soldier pipeline in poor neighborhoods.
I recently learned that Derek Chauvin, who was one of the cops who killed George Floyd, went to a training program at Fort Bennings, which is, formerly known as the School of the Americas. So the School of the Americas is basically a military institution that the US recruits people from Latin America to like train them in torture and like suppression of protests and stuff like that. Like Derek Chauvin went to a training program for law enforcement at a torture institution of the US military. I mean, it's just, when you begin to poke around at this stuff, it's just so striking, the parallels there. It's a revolving door, and it's terrifying.
Yeah. I mean, and it's the training, it's the equipment. School of the Americas trained death squads all throughout Central America in the 1970s and 80s. So, that shouldn't be a surprise to us that, Aimé Césaire in his Discourse of Colonialism said that, the rise of fascism in Europe was just a return of European colonialism onto Europe. And I think that this is the, when we talk about military empire, we have 900 military bases around the world outside of the borders of the United States. And we have all of these places named fort all over the place, right? Like, so this is a military settler colonial society in which now the police are using military grade weaponry and training on its own population. And that's something that we can easily recognize. I grew up in Hawaii, where there's a lot of military. We have military and military police and Honolulu police. So we see the interaction between those kinds of forces. And when you see that here, I mean, I'm seeing armored personnel carriers that are, usually down in Camp Pendleton or somewhere else, being driven throughout the streets in Philadelphia the other month, and now in Portland. So it's something that we should always keep in mind, that the police and the military are like really two peas in a pod.
Yeah, I feel like I'm shaking my head so hard that it might like roll off of my neck. I just want to say that this conversation is so, 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 so important, and that we can't separate the two issues because they're so intertwined. This is an American issue, and this idea of colonialism coming back in on itself, I think that the snake eating its tail, we see it like at the level of police being in our schools, our K-12 schools with our kids, and that they're getting their equipment from our actual military, which we send around the world to oppress other countries and to topple democratically elected presidents and so on, and how all of that is connected to the same money machine and the same parties. This is not like a Democrat or Republican issue, it's an American issue. And it's been going on for so long. And so I don't have the answers to it because it is so big and it can be so intimidating. But I think that as long as we keep this conversation at the forefront and not be too intimidated to bring it up and to make those connections, we can start to inch towards the right kind of answer.
Thank you, everyone. So do we have any other questions from our audience or comments?
There's a question from an iPhone. It may be our previous one or a new person.
Okay. So person who raised their hand on iPhone, could you please ask your question or state your comment?
I got a couple of comments. The first comment is, all you, the panelists, all of you know what you're talking about. If you really want to make change, all of you have to get in positions of change. Like all of you should run for office, political office, in order to make the changes. I mean, I hear all the panelists, they make good points, but you have to get out there and like get involved. And I'm not criticizing, I'm just saying, with your information, all of you need to run for office because all of you bring crucial points to the problem. The second thing I wanted to say is that the police are here to create fear and create a need, right? And the need is to suppress everybody. And like one of the female panelists said, the militarism of the police, if you look around the world, all the riot police, whether they're in Hong Kong or in Philadelphia, dress the same. We have to stop that. Stop putting the metal detectors in the schools and the police, right? And most of all, we have to control weapons in this country and control the weapons that we sell outside the country, right? Nobody should be able to get a semi-automatic machine gun. And the police shouldn't have them either. I mean, we have tens of thousands of people killed in this country. Hello? We have tens of thousands of people in this country that are killed every day. If you didn't have the weapons, you would need all the police that you have. This is planned by the people at the top, right? They get us fighting each other. And if you really want to control the police, what you have to do is stop the overtime for the police. If a police officer makes $50,000 a year, they can make $100,000 with all the overtime. And give people jobs, decent jobs. And a lot of inner city colleges have a lot of money, but the surrounding community is impoverished. And that's sad too. And then you need to define the jurisdictions of police officers. Like if you're a campus police officer, you should just be on the campus. You shouldn't go out into anywhere outside of campus. And maybe increase educational requirements for the police, right? If you want a better officer, then you gotta say maybe they need to have a master's degree instead of a high school diploma. And you gotta get rid of the prison industrial complex. That's really big. that is so big. Like that woman said in the new Jim Crow, they create crime. Certain crimes shouldn't be crimes. The Philadelphia police, they stopped it, but years ago they were busting people for like a half a gram of weed. They have to stop creating crimes. They just create crimes every day. And then we need inclusiveness, right? Those people are the enemy. And the police think that. Like someone raised about the fact that a lot of police officers are warriors. They go to war. So they come home with that same mentality. It's not a us versus them, it's a us thing. And like I said, all of you, this is the last thing I want to say, all of you bring up great points and you should run for office. All of you sound like intelligent people. And if you explain to the people what's going on, some people won't want to hear it. Some people will contradict you, but then other people will say, yo, that's right. And then you can help make the change. And that's all I wanted to say.
I was going to say that I think you should run for office because you seem to be like right on the money with all of that. And I just am completely agreeing with you.
I want to add that, Saudia, were you going to go?
That's okay. I can go after you.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly add that I second many of the comments that you said. I do desperately want to know who you are, but Mr. iPhone. But I also want to say that, you know, just from a kind of social movement perspective in terms of just being an organizer, I think that, you know, people that do want to be politicians, I think that's fine. But I'm actually a really big believer of that power being within all of us. And I think that these conversations that we're having right now, which I have plenty of times with community residents, are so essential to get us all on the same page so that we can organize to have someone run for office, or to critique someone that's already in office, or to help them envision, since I would assume that their mind is heavy with the kind of political and economic concepts, to really allow people themselves to come up with these solutions. And so, like I said, you know, I appreciate that. I'm definitely not a politician, but I think that I really want to advocate for, you know, reclaiming, if you haven't already, the power that we have through being at protests, you know, not just waiting on petitions, through, you know, doing the things that we can do as a community, as a Stockton community, but as a Black community, as a city community, to be able to make that change as well.
So, good stuff. I have similar thoughts that I just wanted to add on in response. So some interesting pieces that I want to highlight, and I do also want to share a really good resource in terms of like, how do we switch from sort of maybe reformist lenses, right, and shift into abolition, because I do think there are some interesting pieces that were brought up that I think Critical Resistance, if folks haven't heard, criticalresistance.org is an amazing hub for looking at how to one, understand how certain reforms or certain calls that we think sound good in terms of increasing accountability still continues the process of putting in more resources into policing, and that's what we want to shift away from. So I do want to challenge the idea of increasing the academic sort of stature or the recommendations that police should have, because one, that it creates more of an incentive for folks to step into roles of police officers, and we already know that there's so many other jobs that either exist or can be created in place of that, because again, the fundamental root of policing has existed historically to oppress and traumatize or intervene from different folks organizing against oppression and against this institution. So I just want to be really clear that like a lot of those resources or positions, right, can go into other things, can go into restorative justice work or healing work. So there's that, right? I really recommend Critical Resistance because it also breaks down how certain things like calling for body cameras, calling for, you know, review boards and trainings, like all those, again, just ultimately are a waste of money because they've already been tried time and time again, uprising and uprising again. The other thing that I also want to say, and also kind of want to push back on, is this idea that one, the most effective way to create change is to be a politician. I think it's actually kind of the opposite, like participating in an electoral process, right? Like that's a tactic that folks are using regardless of what kind of economy they live in or what kind of political environment that they're in. Having some sort of participatory process in voting and running for an election, that is one skill that has been overutilized and has really, unfortunately, been co-opted, right? And it's because a lot of times it's taught that you can only have power through a top-down hierarchy, that you can only have power running to be one person on a board of 17 and you're making decisions for thousands of people. So I do think it's definitely critical for folks to use that as one form of a tactic to wage power, but it is not the defining tactic, right? Folks don't feel empowered often having to rely on a stranger to be accountable to a community. It should be the other way around, right? For folks who decide to pursue politics, the politicians should be the ones who are working in good faith with communities. And what we have seen historically is that 9 times out of 10, right, you may have one politician in a specific area or in a specific, space who is working in good interest, but a lot of times there's so much co-opting or, just watering down the real grassroots work. So yeah, I just empower folks to use their power also within the community if they're also going to use it within an electoral process.
Yeah, one of the things that, I kind of remarked on was the other month was that burning down one police precinct in Minneapolis did a lot more than all the politicians combined in the entire United States. So that's actually where we get our political change, right? I agree, not from the top down, but from us. So with that, I don't see any other hands raised. I want to thank our participants. I want to thank all of you for joining us in this conversation. I want to thank Emery for being the tech person and setting this up. So I want to give a big round of applause to everybody who was on our panel and all of you who participated. This was an excellent conversation, and I think that we have a lot more to go on. So with that, I want to say goodbye. I think are we going to be posting this somewhere? It's being recorded?
It is being recorded. I'm not sure where we're posting it yet, but there will be a recording available. I also want to give a shout out that next Tuesday, during the day, we're going to be a different group of panelists. So one person will also be on that panel. We'll be part of a Decolonizing the Curriculum teach-in. That's next Tuesday, July 28th from 12 to 2 p.m. So block your calendar if you're available to. We'll send out that invite. We didn't want to conflict with this one and have people get confused. But we will post the recording and we'll keep trying to continue the conversation. Thank you, Adam, for moderating. Thank you, all the panelists.
Oh, I was honored to do this. Thank you.
Bye.